And that's what I mean by pluralism. And that's also a term which was used by my research participants because they refer to themselves as religious shoppers. So, and that's a term which I find very fascinating. So in a kind of pluriform movement, one cannot be picky. One picks and chooses according to the needs one has at a particular movement. So according to the religious shoppers whom I interviewed, all different traditions have their own powers. And by combining them, one can be blessed multiply.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Marlo, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, your research really sort of caught my eye when I was looking for academics to sort of shed light on. And the reason being is that you present such exciting ways of looking at Africa. And I want to start off with sort of your earlier work where, as far as I understand, you went and actually lived over there for a year.
Yeah, that's right. So as an anthropologist, I believe in what's called participant observation. So as a child, I was really interested in studying, well, in different cultures, different societies. So my mom always took me to the National Museum of Ethnology in Leiden, my hometown, as you can hear, I'm from the Netherlands. And I became very much fascinated in objects and arts and different ways of life. So from a very young age, I knew I wanted to study different cultures. So initially I was interested in the objects, but then gradually my interest shifted to, I think, more to anthropology. So I decided I wanted to study cultural anthropology, and I regret many choices in my life, but I never regret that I have become an anthropologist, because anthropology has taken me on a long journey. And during this journey, I learned to see things from different perspectives. And I think that has been a very enriching experience. So my first journey took me to the Gambia, which is the smallest country in West Africa. And in the Gambia, I studied youth, I studied gender, I studied popular culture, and I studied Islam. And that results in my previous book called Islam, Youth and Modernity in the Gambia, the Tablighi Jamaat. And this is a book about the transnational Islamic missionary movement, which originated in India and from there spread all over the world, including to Africa. And although it's a very small country, Gambia is often seen as a center of this kind of Tablighi activities in West Africa. So I wanted to know what happens when a transnational movement travels. And I found out during my previous research that the Tablighi Jamaat has given Gambian youth and women in particular new ways to express their Muslim identity. So I was really interested in this movement. And I was also fascinated by the fact that my research interlocutors portrayed themselves as what they called born-again Muslims. So I asked them why they used a Christian term to refer to themselves as Muslims. And they told me that they had been influenced by a group of Chrislam preachers coming from Lagos, Nigeria. And I found this remark intriguing, and I wanted to find out more about these so-called Chrislam preachers in the Gambia. But my search for Chrislam in the Gambia did not lead me anywhere. I found a few journalistic pieces on the movement on the internet, and they all directed me to Nigeria. So in 2010, I decided to switch research fields from the smallest country in Africa, that's the Gambia, to Africa's giant, and that's Nigeria. And it was the beginning of a long, extensive field research on a movement such as Chrislam, which combines elements from Islam and Christianity, as well as other related movements that mix elements from various religious traditions. And initially, I found myself somewhat uneasy with a movement such as Chrislam, because the way we are raised is that we see religious traditions as mutually exclusive. So initially, I didn't know how to make sense out of this movement. And also my audiences at academic conferences and workshops felt uneasy, because every time I presented my research data, people's primary reaction was laughter. So they didn't know how to make sense out of Chrislam, and they reduced it to something trivial against the backdrop of the serious world religions, and that's Islam and Christianity.
Just, can I just interject there? I find that to be very sort of typical of academia, where a phenomena that is actually really happening is sort of, because it doesn't match what their conventional thinking is seen as sort of wild or preposterous. But the reality is, like, I'm very familiar with Nigerian communities, and as are many people in London. And I don't think anybody who knows the Nigerian community doesn't know a person who, has a Christian mother and a Muslim father, which is so common. And Chrislam is sort of like an overarching theme amongst the Nigerian community. So when dealing with that, sort of, how was your initial response to this dismissal from academia?
Well, like I said, initially I found myself also somewhat uneasy with this kind of phenomenon. But then I became aware that it's because we are so much trained in this Abrahamic understanding of religions, where you see religions as mutually exclusive and bounded entities. But as you yourself already rightly remarked, it's not lived practice in a kind of multi-faith setting, such as Nigeria. So what I immediately found out during my field research is, like you already mentioned, it's very common to have extended families composed of Christians, Muslims, as well as practitioners of so-called African traditional religion. And therefore, I think this kind of religious plurality is very much embedded in everyday living. So, for example, my neighbor was a Christian, and he told me that during Christmas, he slaughters a ram in the halal way, lawful in Islam, so that also his Muslim neighbors and his relatives can partake of the meal. And similarly, Christians participate in the end of Ramadan festivities. So that's very much imminent to the way religion is lived in a multi-faith setting. So Yoruba land, the region in southwestern Nigeria on which I focus in my research, is one example, but there are many more multi-faith settings. So we need to rethink the way we have often studied religion in order to do justice to this kind of religious plurality. And I can also give you another example from my network within Nigeria. So I was working with a research collaborator by the name of Toby, and Toby is a Muslim, but he grew up in a kind of extended family compound. So his father was a Muslim. His father married 2 wives. Toby's mother, a Christian, passed away. Then his father married a second wife, a Christian. Toby's brother is a Muslim preacher, and he listens the whole day in the same family compound to tape-recorded sermons of preachers preaching in Arabic. Well, his younger half-brothers are DJs living in the same family house in Lagos. They listen the whole day to popular music. And his younger half-sister is a member of a Pentecostal choir and practices the whole day in the same family house her Christian hymns. So you see here already that within one house, different religious traditions are presented. So that means that we, as scholars of religion, have to rethink the way we have studied religion for a long time. So this division of labor, whereby one scholar studies Islam, a second one Christianity, and a third one African traditional religion, is not very helpful if we want to get a better understanding of these practices of what I call religious pluralism in my forthcoming book.
So when you look at somewhere like Nigeria and this very rich example that you've just given, how much of that can be used for the world as a case study of real coexistence, real, in a world where, the overarching theme is sectarianism, populism? How much can be learnt from Africa and from Nigeria specifically?
Well, although Nigeria is very often in the news and very often in a very negative way, if you look at lived practices, you see that there is a way of a coexistence. And I think the Yoruba are one of the largest ethnic groups in Africa, can teach us a very important lesson about how religions can live together in peace. But I'm not naive, and my book is not meant as a kind of interfaith dialogue. I think there's an important difference between a scholar of religion and a religious scholar. So as a scholar of religion, I try to understand different ways of meaning making, and religion is one way of giving meaning to people's life. Well, I don't pretend that I have the solution to religious conflicts in the world. And I also am very much aware that the movements I'm studying are kind of tiny minorities. A movement like Chrislam has only around 1,000 followers in Lagos, which is nothing compared to these Pentecostal mega churches where sometimes tens of thousands of followers attend the services. So, and I'm very much aware that Christianity and Islam are distinct traditions in Nigeria, but I think there is a way of looking at religion that does more justice to the kind of religious pluralism which is ingrained in lived traditions.
So this concept of religious pluralism, from your experience, is that sort of, at the moment, is that fundamentally linked to Islam and Christianity, or are there other religions that sort of can coexist in this sort of religious pluralism approach?
Well, in my forthcoming book, I have 5 ethnographic case studies, because as an anthropologist, I work with case studies. Chrislam is one example. I think it's the most prominent example of a religious movement, or rather a series of movements that combines elements from multiple traditions, in this case, Christianity and Islam. But there's also Nasfat, and Nasfat is a really interesting organization. It's a Muslim organization, one of the fastest growing Muslim organizations in contemporary Nigeria. And they openly borrow from Pentecostalism because they are concerned that their Muslim children will run away to the Pentecostal churches with their flashy health and wealth gospel and these high-tech services and the promises of upward social mobility. So they borrow openly from Pentecostalism by emphasizing their Muslim doctrine. So that's another example. And then a third example in my book, one chapter, is about Iyo Orunmila. And that's a very interesting movement because it's a movement which combines African traditional religion, in this case Yoruba religion, with Christianity. So what you see is that the congregation, and they assemble on Saturday in a temple, not in a church or in a mosque, but in a temple. And the ground floor of the temple resembles a church with wooden pews. And then after the service, they go upstairs to the first floor where you find a shrine where the local deities, the orishas, are being worshipped. So again, a kind of pluriform movement. And then the final example is that of 2 spiritual movements, the Grill movement and Akanka. And the Grill movement originated in Austria, and Akanka originated in the United States, whereas the other movements originated in Nigeria. So these 2 spiritual movements are coming from abroad. And what I find really interesting is that the Nigerian leaders of the Grill movement and Akanka combine not only Islam, Christianity, as well as African traditional religion, but also Hinduism, Buddhism, science. So kind of eclectic mix. And that's what I mean by pluralism. And that's also a term which was used by my research participants because they refer to themselves as religious shoppers. So, and that's a term which I find very fascinating. So in a kind of pluriform movement, one cannot be picky. One picks and chooses according to the needs one has at a particular movement. So according to the religious shoppers whom I interviewed, all different traditions have their own powers. And by combining them, one can be blessed multiply. It is a very pragmatic approach of practicing religion. So, for example, one of the imams in the Chrislam movement told me that he prayed 8 times a day, 5 times in the Muslim way, 3 times in the Chrislam way. And by doing that, he hoped to benefit from the cumulative power of prayers.
Do they? I mean, someone like Chrislam, do they like a preacher in Chrislam? Does he or she consider themselves to be in like a unique religion in its own right, or do they just see it more like a tradition or a culture?
That's an interesting question, because I think it's both. On the one hand, they're very much aware that what they're practicing is quite unique. On the other hand, they're also aware that it fits very much into Yoruba social life. Like you yourself already noticed, people have long been participating in each other's ritual festivities because that's the way of Yoruba cultural identity. So I think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
But and it's it's not only a Nigerian phenomenon. I think you see it in more multi-faith settings. But I think what makes Nigeria unique, or Yoruba land, that's southwestern Nigeria, unique, is quite a large area where these kind of movements are very much prominent, and they're not just minorities, they are very much embedded in everyday living.
Going back to the Gambia, how long did you actually explore phenomena and practices in Gambia?
Oh, I worked in the Gambia for over a decade. And in the Gambia, I first was told about Chrislam. I never came across Chrislam in a country like Gambia, which is really a Muslim majority setting. I think 90% of the population is Muslim. So in Gambia, I really studied this Tablighi Jamaat, but because, and it is this transnational Islamic reformist movement, but because the Gambian people with whom I worked called themselves born again Muslims, I became interested why they would use a Christian term to refer to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Gambia, I spent, I think, over a decade. And then I moved to Nigeria because I found this Chrislam movement so intriguing, and I couldn't find anything in the Gambia. So that was the beginning of a new field research in Nigeria.
Somewhere like Gambia, as I understand it, which is a very conservative Muslim environment, in many ways, how has sort of the influence of other West African countries around them that are Christian or that are more open to the West, how has that influence changed people's practices and people's everyday lives in Gambia?
I would not call Gambia a very conservative society, because Gambia is a traditional Muslim society. Many Muslims have been practicing a kind of Sufi Islam, a mystical Islam, but under influence of people studying abroad. And don't forget that Gambia is a kind of the tourist industry is the main source of living in the Gambia. So many tourists are coming to the Gambia, bringing their own ideas. So you see an interesting mixture, but the majority population is Muslim, practicing this kind of Sufi Islam. The younger generation sees it very often as a kind of cultural Islam, and they wanted to explore new ways of expressing their Muslim identity. And therefore, I think a movement, a transnational movement like the Tablighi Jamaat, which originates in South Asia, could then become a kind of quite a prominent movement in the Gambia, under influence of traveling Tablighi preachers coming from South Asia, but especially among the younger population. So I think the Tablighi Jamaat is very much a youth movement in the Gambia.
And so, do you think, because of the fact that it's a youth movement, do you think in the coming years or in the coming decades, it's going to sort of transform sort of the understanding of religion in Africa in general?
I don't know if I can speak about the entire Africa, but I think the ways people have interpreting Islam in a small country in the Gambia have been changing under influence of this Tablighi youth culture, where younger people tell their parents that the way they practice Islam is not the right Islam, it's a kind of cultural Islam. So you see families falling apart as a result of young people turning to a more reformist-oriented form of Islam. And what I find interesting is that is a small minority. I think only 1% of the Gambian population practices something like Tablighi Islam. But for me, it doesn't mean that it is not representative. Although it's a small movement, I think it's very much symptomatic of wider religious change and transformations that are difficult to map if we study only Sufi Islam versus reformist Islam. So I'm very much interested, again, in how people practice religion in everyday living. And then you see that some Tablighi youth called themselves, well, they told me that they found themselves in a kind of religious burnout. So under influence of a burnout, some of them became kind of disinterested in a Tablighi lifestyle and turned towards a more Salafi-oriented Islam, because they thought that, well, Tablighi Islam is very much about going on missionary tours to tell other people to become practicing Muslims or better Muslims. It was not so much about gaining more knowledge about Islam. So under influence of what they called burnout, I think it's a fantastic term, some young people turn towards more Salafi-oriented forms of Islam, whereas other young people, after a while, when they had more professional obligations, when they started working or they started marrying, they couldn't go on missionary tours every weekend, or their wives would not allow them, or the bosses would not allow them because they had now professional jobs. So then you see that some of them return to a kind of more Sufi form of Islam. So it's not one teleological movement away from Sufi Islam towards a more reformist Islam. You see that kind of back and forth. And I think because these kind of new Islamic movements in the Gambia are youth movements, there is a high turnover in these movements based on the fact that they are youth movements, if that makes sense.
So does that mean that this kind of movement is because it's high turnover? Does that mean it's not destined to grow any bigger? Like it's capped at sort of this level that it is at now because it's just not sustainable?
I think it is sustainable, and I think you see a growth already happening. I conducted the research about around 2005. So I think the movement is growing. So I think it's sustainable, but it's not that all people are moving towards a more Tablighi oriented form of Islam. You see a kind of waves. It's very much part of how people practice Islam, and also people are interested in pursuing their youthful interests. So after a while, people cannot live up to their kind of Islamic principles and then return to a kind of former lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. So if we sort of go a little bit further back, what drew you to Gambia?
Well, I think very pragmatic reasons. I had never traveled far away. I studied at Leiden University, and I had a chance because my university was in a kind of an exchange program with the Gambia. So I had the chance of going to Gambia, and I thought, well, I've never been far away from home. Let's go to a small country. Like Holland is small, Gambia is small. I think that was a wise decision. But then after a while, when my research interest, I think, like I said, as an anthropologist, well, you're on a long journey. And during my journey, I also developed new topics, new research interests. And then I moved to Africa's giants, Nigeria.
That transition between a relatively, a very small country to a massive country, how was that?
Yeah, that's embarrassing to say as a cultural anthropologist, but I found it a culture shock, not only because of the scale of my new field site. Lagos is the third largest city in the world. It's quite overwhelming, but also because, like I said, like initially I found myself uneasy with this kind of pluriform movements that combine different religious traditions, because it didn't fit into the way I was trained to think along religious boundaries, right? So I found that quite difficult in the beginning, but it was also very, again, an enriching experience.
Absolutely, must have been. And so now that you've sort of you've published this book and you've done quite extensive work in Nigeria, where do you sort of see the next steps in your research being?
That's an interesting question, because I'm in the process of writing a new research proposal. So, well, as an academic, you always have to apply for funding. So hopefully my next research project will bring me again to Nigeria, but also other African countries, because I want to explore the interplay between sports and religion. And that you might find that funny, but I have strong interest in religion, but also in sports, because many years ago, because as academics, you really live in your head. So I wanted to find a sport which would help me to get out of my head. But if you are, for example, running or hiking, you still have time to think about your work. So I wanted to find something which would really knock me out. And the only sport I could think of which would knock me out is boxing. So I started boxing and I became very passionate about boxing. But now I will never become a professional boxer. I'm much too old and I'm not good enough, but I really enjoy it. But I now want to study the interplay between sports and religion, because it's my personal passion, but also because I think they have both a lot in common. Well, many people think sports is something secular, belonging to the secular domain, and religion is sacred. I think that the two have really a lot in common because they inculcate similar values. Think about obedience, think about duty, perseverance, fair play, teamwork, and both have kind of gestures and practices which have a strong ritual character. And sport heroes are almost becoming sanctified figures. And the world religions have long used the popularity of sports as well of athletes to draw in new people into religion. So as a kind of conversion mechanism and to display positive values. So I want to study whether sport and religion are both motors to development in a continent like Africa, because Africa is popularly known as a sporting continent, especially football. It's very prominent in Africa, but is also known as one of the most religious places in the world. So I want to bring together my interest in sports and religion, and then hopefully I can conduct an ethnographic case study on boxing, Pentecostalism, and Islam in Lagos. So
it's very, very interesting because, you know, I mean, coincidentally, a little while ago, I was watching a documentary about Dambe, which is a Nigerian type of martial arts, which is sort of very indigenous to the northern Muslim Nigerians, and it's a type of boxing that is sort of is grown in popularity, and I mean, it just rings a bell because it ties both of these concepts. Because the question of the documentary was, is it Islamically permissible? Because, you know, you can cause all this injury to somebody else and what have you, and it appears that sort of the Islamic scholars in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, saw it as Islamically permissible or something that they don't get involved in because it provided a livelihood for people, which is really interesting because, I mean, it just shows you how rich Nigeria is, or Africa in general is, for looking at these you know, I suppose completely different concepts and tying them together and how they formulate, you know, and enrich society. So I think it's a fantastic sort of approach to look at sport and religion. And, you know, I'm sure that you personally have seen loads of examples of where it's applicable.
Yeah, definitely. But well, after the show, please give me the link to this the YouTube clip, which the documentary. I would be very interested to watch it. But I think that's quite common in Africa, that there's a link between traditional sports like wrestling and the more Olympic games like boxing. And I want to see then how also traditional ideas and religious ideas can combine, and what this tell us about national identity and how religions are divisive, but also bringing people together, and not only fighters, but also people from different religious backgrounds. So I think there's a lot to explore there, and hopefully the funders see it that way as well. But that's my,
So absolutely. What advice would you give to anyone who wants to sort of get into anthropology and look at these sorts of phenomena that you're looking at?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think your mission with this show is that you want to bring knowledge to a wide audience, as wide, as diverse as possible. And I think I share that same mission because as an anthropologist, I think we have a duty to apply our knowledge to present day social problems. And that's what I'm trying to do in my research. So that means that we have to rethink also the way we have conducted research for a long time. So instead of just writing books and articles, which we do because it's part of academic life, I also think that we have to think about other ways of bringing out our work to a wider audience. And during my research in Nigeria, I had the honor to collaborate with the Nigerian award-winning photographer Akintunde Akinleye. He's a fantastic photographer, and we worked on a photo exhibition together. And so what I'm trying to do in my work, I want to cross religious boundaries, and therefore I called my forthcoming book Crossing Religious Boundaries, Islam, Christianity, and Yoruba religion in Lagos, Nigeria. I want to cross disciplinary boundaries. I want to bring insights from anthropology, from sociology, from religious studies, from Islamic studies, from urban studies, history, philosophy into conversation with each other, because only that way we can somehow move beyond this kind of traditional division of labor, where one scholar studies Islam, another one Christianity, and the third one African traditional religion. But I also want to rethink boundaries between artistic and more scholarly ways of representation. And therefore I work together with this photographer, and therefore one of my research outputs is this kind of was this photo exhibition, and this is the title of our exhibition. It's called The Spiritual Highway: Religious World Making in Mecca City, Lagos. And that exhibition traveled to different places. So just before the pandemic, it was on show at the Hart Museum of Art in Florida. And I think that's important. We have a duty as academics to think about how we make our knowledge relevant to present day social problems. And many academics seem to think that to theorize means being illegible. I don't share that. I think we have to write in an accessible way, and also think about different audience we can reach, and also different media we can use to reach different audiences.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and you're absolutely spot on. If we live in if academia and education lives in a vacuum to society, then it's not fit for purpose. And the work that you're doing and the approach that you're taking is very much what we're trying to promote, and getting people to genuinely understand the world around them without it being without having to read the most advanced language in a research paper. And so I think, as I said, I think your work is amazing. If you can share with me those links so that we can for the photo exhibition and for the book, so that we can get our audience to get instant access to them. But Marlo, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and I hope to have you on sometime soon when you've developed your further research.
Thank you very much. I look forward to talk to you again in hopefully the near future when I get funding for my next project. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.